It's great to have you here.
Nice to be here.
So this new book looks at the wealth divide in America. Explain what you mean by that, and what do you think the causes are?
Well, the wealth divide, or income divide, is that a few people in our country get an outsized share of the national pie. Just a couple of numbers. The upper 1%, their share has doubled since 1980, from 10% to 20%. And 20% go to 1%. In terms of wealth, it's even more unequal. That 1% gets almost 40%. New data out just a day before yesterday from the Federal Reserve show how bad things are in the middle and the bottom, where they've lost almost 40% of their wealth in the last 3 years, putting us back to the early 1990s.
Let's talk about some of the reasons why. One of the big political hot potatoes is the capital gains tax. So people who are very wealthy, who make most of their money from income, investments, are only taxed at 15% when the rest of us pay much more than that. Is that an example of how this divide came to be?
Very much so, and it also explains one of the other big points I make in the book. We're paying a very high price for this inequality, not only in having a divided society, but having a less efficient economy. Because when you tax speculation, which is a lot of the capital gains goes for people who gamble and win, gamble in the stock market, gamble on land, then you divert resources into speculation, and you aren't creating more wealth. When you encourage the banks to engage in predatory lending or abusive credit card practices, money goes from the bottom to the top. So again, rather than creating more wealth, you have more resources go into these activities that really just move money around and move, unfortunately, money around from the bottom to the top.
Wow. I heard recently that half of Congress, half of the members of Congress are millionaires. What does that say about this whole topic?
Well, that's really one of the key points, that when you live in a more divided society, people in one group don't understand the lives of the vast majority. You know, they don't depend on public schools, they don't depend on public parks, they don't depend on public transportation, so they don't know the lives of the other 99%. What makes it even worse is that then those at the top use their money to influence the political process, to continue the rules of the game, the economic and political rules of the game, to make our society even more divided.
Right. They help write the tax codes.
They write the tax codes. They write the rules that say, for instance, that derivatives, those rescue securities, get first claim in the event of bankruptcy, but student loans can never be discharged in bankruptcy, no matter how bad the education the kid gets.
Wow, that's interesting. I want to get to Europe and the global economy in just a second, but first, what do you think the fix is? When you're talking to people who are frustrated about this, it just seems like an overwhelming problem. What are the fixes? Well,
it's not an overwhelming problem in the sense that other economies, other societies have seen where they're going and said, we don't want it. Brazil, a high level of inequality, but over the last 20 years has brought it the degree of inequality down. In the last chapter, I lay out a fairly comprehensive agenda, things that are not that difficult economically. Make a fair tax system, raise the tax on speculators so that they pay the same rate as people who work for a living. Not something that's that difficult to do. The real problem is the politics. The question is, we've gotten ourselves into a vicious circle where economic inequality leads to inequality of political power, and that inequality of political power exacerbates inequality of economic power. So we're going to have to, at the end, do something about campaign finance reform, about revolving doors. At other moments of our history where we face this growing divide, we too pull back from the brink. Gilded Age, we had the Progressive Era, the Roaring '20s, we had the progressive legislation that led to Social Security, Wagner Act, a whole set of other pieces of legislation. I'm hopeful that once we realize where we're going, we'll do the same now.
Let's talk about Europe and some of the problems there. It seems like banking is really at the heart of a lot of the problems that we're having as societies today. In Spain, massive protests over the bailout plan there. A lot of uncertainty about whether that government is even going to be able to survive that. What do you think is the root cause of all this trouble in terms of countries and their finances in a shambles.
Well, the problem in Europe, to a very large extent, is related to only one thing. When they created the euro just over a decade ago, it was a very flawed concept. It was a politically motivated, not economically motivated. But the politics wasn't strong enough to create the institutional frameworks that they needed. The result of that was you had Spanish banks relying on the Spanish government to back them up. But Spanish depositors, Spanish citizens, can move their money very easily over to German banks. And so there's a run out of Spanish banks, or out of Italian banks.
Wow.
That weakens the Spanish banks. That means they can't lend. That weakens the economy, weakens the ability of the government to bail out to support the banks.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, because of the economic recession that began here in the United States, the economy isn't doing very well. And so the banks have been having to bail out the governments.
Yeah. Got about 10 seconds left. I just want to say thank you very much. You're going to be at Town Hall in Seattle tonight?
That's right.
Okay, Joseph.